All right. So let's see. It's 4:30, and thus it's time, in some ways, to begin. My name is Rosalie Moffett, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English here at USI. And on behalf of the Southern Indiana Reading Series, I'd like to welcome you all of you beautiful names in the participant list, to this virtual reading. What's going to happen is that I will introduce our reader. He will read, and then there will be time for a Q&A with questions from the audience. And you will do this through the little option at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. So please, as you listen, hold on to your question, and then when the time comes, you can enter it into the Q&A box. It's also important to say that today's event would not be possible without contributions and support from the USI Society for Arts and Humanities, the USI Foundation, Dean Del Dowdy, and the College of Liberal Arts, Dr. Juana Popescu-Sandu, and the Department of English. And I am so grateful, we are so grateful for their continued support of the series. It's deeply my heartfelt pleasure to be hosting Edgar Kunz today, whose second book, which I have here to wave around, whose second book, Fixer, is a powerful meditation on class and capitalism, on the devastation and banality of loss, and on the redemptive potential of love. It, in lines that are as elegant as they are wrenching in their simplicity, Edgar offers us a way into considering what can and cannot be repaired. The book turns its camera on the speaker's fractured emotional interior, not only reeling from a failed marriage and navigating the reality and aftermath of the death of his alcoholic father, but also picking through the American economic landscape, whose careers have disintegrated into absurd crumbs of gig work and temp jobs. And in some of the most touching and convincing contemporary poems about love, the book cracks its door and lets in some beautiful light. Edgar Kunz is the author of two poetry collections, Fixer, published by Ecco in 2023 and named a New York Times Editor's Choice book, and Tap Out, published by Ecco in 2019. And I will just take a moment to shill for that book, which is really terrific. You should also check out his first book, Tap Out. He has been a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, a MacDowell Fellow, and a Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. His work has been supported by fellowships and awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, and the Sewanee Writers Conference. Recent poems appear in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, the American Poetry Review, and Oxford American. He lives in Baltimore, where he teaches at Goucher College and in the Newport MFA. Edgar, thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Rosie. Yeah, super meaningful to be here. Thank you all. What is it, a Thursday night? Is it Thursday? It's a Thursday night. You could be doing anything, but you're here at a poetry reading. So thank you all. I think I saw Ron is in the participants as well. What's up, Ron? Yeah, wish we were all in person, but this is pretty good too. I gave a reading one time, and it was the same night as the finale to Game of Thrones. And I remember going in and saying, "Oh man, you guys are here. That's so cool. You could be watching Game of Thrones right now." And one person literally stood up and walked out of the room. But joke's on her, right? The finale was terrible. That show ended up being such a disappointment. Anyway, cool. Yeah, I published this book in August of this year. I've been on tour since. I had sabbatical in the fall for my teaching job, so I gave a bunch of readings here in the US and abroad. I think this is reading number 48 or something like that. And it's my very last one of the tour. So this is how I'm wrapping up the tour. It's with all of you. So if I'm not very good at reading my own poems, I've got no excuse, I've gotten a lot of reps in, so we'll just see how it goes. Oh, this would usually be the time because you can't respond to me, the way this is set up. So this would usually be the time where I would ask, has anyone been through a breakup? And you'd be like, ah, yes, of course. Like all of us have been through a breakup. Yeah, thanks, Rosie. And then I'd say, have you ever been through a breakup where afterward you felt like you deserved to be struck by lightning? And then some of you would laugh nervously, and I would say, okay. And then, does anyone love Stevie Nicks? And then some of you would be like, I have no idea who that is. And other people would be like, yes, of course, that's the one true love of my life. And if you're in the whatever the middle of that Venn diagram is, this poem is for you. It's called Day Moon, and it's the very first poem in the book. After I left, I waited for someone, a friend or her herself, to walk quickly up to me on the bus or in the bustling coffee shop and slap my face, spit on my hands, call me a bastard, a real motherfucker. By waited, I mean I wanted to be revealed by some visible sign. A welt to ride the ledge of my cheek through the glass-littered streets. It didn't come, and I grew desperate. I stared too long at strangers at Safeway. I bought boxes of clementines and ate them like a possum on the train, cramming the rinds in the gap between the seat and the wall. I drank warm beer. I made no calls. I sat on a hot metal bench by a briny lake and tried to imagine the lives of the joggers passing in front of me, their joys, their sicknesses and regrets. I was useless. I thought of my friend who wrote a novel over a long winter in Nova Scotia, read it once, and buried it in the copse of birches behind the house. He chose the spot, he said, for its plainness, so he couldn't remember later and dig it up. And in this way, one medicated season slid into the next without incident. Gardenia bloom, persistent sun. I fell in love with the perfect voice of a Midwest radio DJ from a station I streamed on my phone, called in one request after another. I fell in love with a video of Stevie Nicks singing backstage to her makeup artist. Sheer cotton dress, their harmonies breezy and immaculate. I woke around noon to the thub-thub of helicopters and another unsober voicemail from my dad angling for a loan. Went out in my underwear and found a fine black powder settling on the windowsills, dusting the parked cars. A day moon suspended in orange haze. It turned out a man who would go months without getting caught was methodically setting fire to the half-built condo complexes one by one. 1 in 10,000 residents is a billionaire, the same article told me, though I could be forgiven for thinking the headlands were burning again. The intervals between disasters collapsing, I caught my neighbor's eye. She was stretching on her stoop in a fantastic powder blue tracksuit. What a world, I said, and she didn't seem to hear, and jogged across the narrow street, the moon behind her rising or sinking, or neither. It was hard to know. I'm gonna imagine a lot of like snaps in the room. I'm gonna imagine a lot of people being like, wow, wow, he really did it with that one. This is fun. I get to make up my own audience reaction. Oh yeah. Does anyone know? Oh yeah, here's another one. Does anyone know about McCormick Spice Company? And you all say, of course, it's the spice company that's all over every grocery store in America with the little red caps on everything. And I say, yeah, that one. I used to work for them. After college, I lived in Baltimore really cheaply. I think my rent was $240 a month or something like that. But it's because I was living in kind of an inhumane situation that no one should have been living in. The house was falling down, and I get into it a little bit in the poem. And I temped for McCormick Spice Company, taste testing dips. So my job was to go in and eat dips and tell them what I thought about the dips. And this poem I'm really proud of. It basically just explains what my job was. I remember showing it to my editor for this book, and I was like, "What about this dips one? You know, do you like it?" And she was like, "Do you like it?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's put it right up front." I don't know, just proving there's no quality control in these books. If the poet wants it bad enough, it goes in. This one's called Tester. I catch a bus out to the county and check in at a beige terminal, and they ask me about the smells and textures of various dips, and I click appealing or not appealing, then elaborate in the text box below. Artichoke and French onion, spicy 3-bean queso. I got in on referral. I live with 7 other people. I measure rent and how many sessions I have to do with the dips. I start testing what I can get away with. Notes of bright espresso, mouthfeel of a sun-ripe plum. I write longer and longer. I don't think they read a word. It's weeks before you're entered into the system, more weeks to get your tiny check. Aline says, if you think it's a scam, why do you keep saying yes? In the fluorescent room, I receive one dip after another from blue-gloved hands, always the same plain tortilla chips to dip with, the same hands clearing away the tiny plastic cups. I tinker with my descriptions. If I need water, they bring me water in slightly larger cups. It was the best job I ever had, honestly. They fed me dips that were mostly delicious, and I worked on my little poems, and nobody bothered me. This line struck me this time more so than other times. If you think it's a scam, why do you keep saying yes? You know, those of us that are critical of contemporary capitalism or whatever semi-hellscape we're living through right now, that's a valid question, isn't it? If you think it's a scam, why do you keep saying yes? Why do you keep participating? I think maybe a better question would be how, how do you participate? Since participation is kind of compulsory. Well, where should I go now? I'll go to the middle. Between my first book and my second book, well, that's not even true. Right before my first book came out, my dad died. And he was a young man. He was 52 years old. He was an addict and an alcoholic and had been in free fall for the better part of a decade, homeless on and off, living on people's couches when he wasn't living out of his van, and just generally having a really, really hard time. And that first book is an attempt in a way to connect with a person that I couldn't connect with, who wasn't capable of connecting with me in a healthy way. And I think poems can be that, they can be these sort of wishes or these sort of extension of the hand in a way that you can't actually do in real life, or that wouldn't be healthy to do in real life. It's a way of offering love to a person who's beyond you. So these middle poems, in this second book, I wrote basically first. I went 2 years without writing, and that was awful for me, because when you think of yourself as a writer and you've internalized a lot of ideas about what being a productive person is, if you've sort of tried to apply the tenets of capitalism to your practice, to your artistic practice, then not writing for 2 years is a disaster. You feel worthless. You feel like a fraud. You feel like you're not this thing that you've been telling everybody that you are, because you haven't been producing, you haven't been cranking out the product that people associate with that thing. And that's been really, really hard for me to get over. And this book is an attempt to articulate some of that and to try to get past some of that in my own writing life. But all to say that 2 years without writing, and then I was house sitting for a friend, and I wrote all of these middle poems in a week and a half. I think I'd been avoiding my subject, I wasn't brave enough to talk about it. Not enough distance between me. It was still too hot and too close, I didn't have enough perspective. So these poems they all look like this. I mean, you might know if you have a copy of the book, but they're all 18 lines. They're kind of long sonnets. And they talk about me and my brothers meeting up in New England and clearing out my dad's apartment, and trying to figure out what he was going to mean to us and what we were going to mean to each other in the aftermath. I'm just going to read a handful of them and pause a little bit in between. Here's the first one. We're breaking into your apartment through your bedroom window. The maintenance guy's ladder is propped against the sill. I climb the ladder rung by rung. It shivers. I try not to look down. A face appears in the glass. What are you doing? The face says. I'm looking for my dad's. I say, I thought this was his window. Aren't you Ken's boy? He says. No, I say, Chris's. Oh, Chris, he says. He's dead. I know, I say. I thought you could be Ken's, he says. Sorry, I say. Believe me, the face says. Not my first rodeo. I climb down. We haul the ladder to the next window and try again. Better than the minivan you slept a winter in. American Legion parking lot siphoning gas for heat, but not much better. Cinder block apartment building on Homestead, a couple miles from Mom's. Got in through the window, waded through the cans and bedding, left it open for the smell. Tried not to look at the stain. Tried to be respectful, like in a museum. Stood for so long in front of your dresser, my brother touched my elbow. Everything we touch, you touched. Your socks, your coat, the cash in your pockets, the cellophane from a fresh pack, Zippo with a carving of a whale, proud ship in the distance. A side note and a little insider baseball. This this cover, that's my dad's actual lighter. No disrespect to Ecco press. I feel lucky to be supported by and so on. But they sent me some truly ghastly covers. I hated all of them so much. And so finally, after going back and forth with them and feeling their patience waning, I asked a friend to take a photo of my dad's lighter. I was out of town, but I had her come and let herself into the house and take it off the mantle where I'd been keeping it. It's really the one artifact that I kept from this whole experience of clearing out where he lived. And I think, I think it's a cool cover. And it's certainly really meaningful to me. So I'm glad they let me do it. This one borrows a line, kind of. I mean, it takes its inspiration from this Natasha Trethewey poem, Myth. And the first line of that poem, the first and last line of that poem is, I was asleep while you were dying. It's about her mother, It's this beautiful mirror poem, actually. So it goes like basically line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it goes line 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's the exact same lines, but in reverse order, and it works. It's like magic, formal poem. But it got me thinking, like, right, where was I when my dad died? And so this is what I came up with. I think I was in California when you died. There's a window, the cop said, but we can't be sure. Maybe it happened while Kay and I were having sneaky sex, then linking up with friends we missed, friends from when we used to live there. Or while getting hammered touring our old spots, Baggies, Heart and Dagger, Eli's Mile High, and we tried to call it. But when we got back, the neighbors were still dancing in their Halloween best, so we started swigging from a plastic handle and sharing cigs and shout singing Baby's Black Balloon Makes Her Fly. Maybe then. Or when a bearded man in sequins piggybacked our friend and we reached on tiptoe to pull ripe mellows from the dark. My brother said this one to me over the phone. I called him up, which is stupid to do, but I called him up and kind of asked for some fact checking, which I did not want. And then when he offered me some fact checking, I was furious. But I asked him a kind of offhand question. I said, when's the last time you saw Dad? And this is what he told me. I mean, basically word for word, this is what he said. Renee and I were doing some limb work, Noah says, on the tree out front, that twisty pine at the corner of the house, taking a couple widows off it. And Dad drives up drunker than I've ever seen him. We're close in a red Ford Focus. Gives me the biggest hug he can, considering he dropped 20 pounds since I last saw him. And I'm the ground guy holding the rope. Puts his arm around my shoulder and just kind of stands there. Neither of us saying a word, not knowing after 2, 3 minutes he'll get back in the car and drive off. Last time I'll ever see him, because when you're the ground guy, you got to focus on the guy in the tree. You mess up and that limb swings out and hits the line. Bang, the whole block goes dark. These are feeling kind of good to read. Yeah, maybe I'll do 2 more of these and then one last poem. Yeah, one strangeness of having an addict dad who used to be really social, had a lot of friends and was really involved and so on. But then as his addiction took hold of him, he was more and more isolated until the end he didn't have any friends. He pushed everyone away and he was basically alone. Is that those people who knew him back then have such a fond idea of who he is. And because they weren't involved in the whole decline and dissolution and disintegration, they kind of held him there. You know what I mean? They held him there and they hadn't updated their sense of who he was. And so I had a lot of conversations that went kind of like this. Chris, she says, oh, you mean Handy? Great guy, life of the party. Party was always at his place, him and your mom's. Plus, he could fix anything. He was amazing. Leaky faucet, done. Sticky door, done. Lawnmower won't start, done. And give him 3 of whatever. You name it. Didn't matter if he was blasted or what. Give him a stapler, a pipe wrench, and a coffee pot, and he'd juggle them as long as you like. And every time you'd think, no way, it's over, he's finished. He'd float it all right in front of you, smooth as a seal, then set them down easy one by one. It was magic. Everyone clapping and carrying on. Can't believe you never saw it. It's how he always was. Yeah, my mom gets the last word in this section. She gets the last word in my real life too, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Yeah. This one I published, I published a bunch of these separately, but this one I published as piano. I held him together as long as I could, she says. He stopped working, stopped coming upstairs. He was like tissue paper coming apart in water, like smoke in my hands. It had nothing to do with you, baby. You left when you had to. I met a woman once who worked on pianos, said it was a hard job, the tools, the leverage, the required ear. I love it, she said, but it's brutal. The second I step away, it's already falling out of tune. It's funny, the end of that poem I'd written some years prior, because I got talking, I hate talking to people on airplanes, to be honest, because it's risky, you know? Every once in a while you get someone and you're like, cool, I'm happy to be doing this. This person is interesting. They know how to listen. They're an equal participant in this conversation. But I feel like for the most part, that's not how it goes. But I got talking to this person who ended up being a piano tuner at Johns Hopkins. And she said a lot of really striking stuff that I was like scribbling the whole time, writing things down that she was saying. But one of the most poignant was that she said, this work is actually really devastating. Because as soon as you step away from the piano, it starts going out of tune. It's never as perfect as the moment that you're done tuning. It begins this slow process of becoming out of tune. And and I just put that in my mom's mouth. I put it in my mom's voice for the end of that poem, and it just clicked right into place as if it had been waiting for that poem to arrive. And those of you that write, and you probably jot down clever things, good lines, things that you overhear that sound kind of cool. And I don't know about you, but I try to shoehorn them into poems all the time. It never works. It never, ever, ever works. It just ends up feeling like too clever, too willed, like there's too much, like you're just desperate for it to work, and it doesn't because it's not an organic part of the poem. It doesn't arise out of the poem. It's just something that you're trying to, lever into place. But this time it just fit. It fit right. It's one of the only times in my life that that's happened. Which is also to say you can lie in your poems. My mom never said that, but it's pretty cool that she does say it in the poem. It doesn't make it any less true, you know? Yeah. Anyway, I'll read one last one. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and I'm excited to do a little Q&A where I hopefully I get to hear your voices or at least get your questions somehow and then offer an insight. So this is the last poem I'm going to read. It's a love poem. Yeah. What else do I want to say about it? Do you know what a night heron is? And then if I'm imagining the audience, you're saying, No, not really. I know what a heron is, but not a night heron necessarily. Let me tell you, a night heron is a heron in name only. It's actually a very ugly little sinister bird. It only comes out at night. It's quite small. It spears fishes in the darkness. It's like if Gollum was a bird, but like a little, maybe a little more handsome than that. Anyway, where Katie and I lived, Katie's my sweetheart. This was the first place we lived together in California, in Oakland. And we live by this lake that's just off of downtown. And it's kind of a bird sanctuary. There are all these cormorants and pelicans. I mean, really gorgeous, majestic birds that I'd never seen before, in person. But of course, the one that we became obsessed with was this ugly little guy, the night heron. So he makes an appearance in the poem, but yeah, I guess one other thing is that uh, the poem references Harry Belafonte, which is he's a calypso singer. He weirdly, if you know the movie Beetlejuice, some of his songs appear in that old movie, but he's iconic, he's got the Banana Boat song, and he's got yeah, this song, Jump in the Line, Rock Your Body in Time. Okay, I believe you. You probably know what I'm talking about. Anyway, that song appears in this poem as well. Night Heron. What now? You'd flown in from a Midwest city named for its rowdy summertime abundance, lying, saying you were coming to visit friends in San Francisco, and I had taken the train from chilly Oakland to meet you, and we rode north, carefully not touching. I took you to the tiny one-room apartment I had escaped to after the divorce and fried us nervously some potatoes in a cast iron pan, a little rosemary, which we did not eat because you kissed me hard. And we went in a rush to the mattress I'd bought off a guy in a semi-famous band, and had only the day before gotten off the floor and onto the pine wood bed frame I'd found and hoisted on my back and carried down out of North Berkeley, arms wide, weaving through the side streets, towing the center line to avoid snagging the Buckeyes leaning out. It was about suffering in public. It was dramatic, sure, but the dramas of my life those days were pitched as high as I could stand, higher sometimes. I said, breathless, I want to taste you. And you said, please, yes. And later, out at the edge of the lake, huddled against the damp wind, hot grease soaking through a paper bag, licking salt from each other's fingers obscenely, a night heron peered up at us from the reeds, small, hunched, dipping its shining beak in the shallows, not particularly beautiful, but a heron nevertheless. The same one we were sure we saw perched on the awning outside the theater, whose marquee shouted slogans like, "We live in a fake democracy," and "Prevent unwanted presidencies with hand-counted paper ballots." And later, the cabin we rented with friends in Calaveras, snow melt vaulting the redwoods to magnificent heights, drinking rye, and each of us practicing our best wolf howl at the waning moon, which was ridiculous. Yes, but once we started, it became impossible to stop. Waking up next morning hoarse and happy, and you moved west. And we lived together in a studio overlooking the cafe dumpster, and then back east on the dream of a house and a garden. And then my father died, and at almost the same age yours did, and both from drink and an unnameable sadness. I went back to Connecticut alone. 3.5 days, my mother said, before anyone had found him in his apartment on the far side of town. And going with my brother, which we should not have done, and dragging the mattress out, and clearing the maggots off the ceiling with a shop vac, and so on. And later you came, and we walked through the basement of my mother's house. I wanted to show you where for a while he lived, and how. And you slung your arm around my waist, and we moved slowly together, bare fluorescent bulb shining on the Budweiser ashtray, the carpentry tools I would inherit, the ratty couch he crashed on for years. You held up an old calypso record he loved and sang out softly, "Jump in the line, rock your body in time," and I sang back softly, "Okay, I believe you." And after a while, Mom at the top of the stairs shouting, "What are you kids doing down there?" And climbing the steps, you pinch my elbow and ask if I'm okay. And I hear myself say yes, which is not a lie, though I'm not listening. I'm letting myself feel how astonishing what our love can make of a place like that. Yeah, that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you, Edgar.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Um,
I'm imagining roaring applause.
oh goodness, okay,
Thunderous
I'm gonna do
applause.
it.
Yeah, no, no, no,
Everyone
no,
else
no, no, no,
as well.
no, no, no.
Um,
Everyone's saying poems, poems.
I had forgotten how many wondrul landmarks there are in that book, like Baggies and Lake Merritt and those night herons.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's familiar places.
Yeah, you lived in Oakland too, right? Did you live by Lake Merritt?
I lived right above Baggies, actually.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, what a great divey mess that bar is. I remember they had a Christmas tree up all year long, right?
Yeah, well, they had their creepy Halloween decorations,
Oh
for
yeah, sure,
Halloween, and
sure.
they had Christmas up for a long time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, the comments are all clapping,
Oh, I love it.
applause, and praise.
Oh,
Um, so now is our time. I mean, I would actually just love to kind of like hang out and reminisce about Oakland, California,
oh,
but
totally, yeah.
someone is chanting poems, 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 just so you know.
Oh, nice. Oh yeah, I've got the chat open now. Oh, what's up, Maya? Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, Maya.
And so we can hear some questions. I mean, you can like I can look at both the chat and the Q&A. I'm not really sure why there are like both of these functions. I don't know. Audience, you can feel free to follow your heart
Huh.
um, and ask a question. And then just to get like the wheels greased or whatever, I'll start with one.
Sure.
Um, and so actually, I really love that you talked about the way that the end of the poem that was in the New Yorker as piano came from this conversation on the plane, because one of the things that's so striking, I think, about this book in particular is its sort of memoir arc and memoir feel.
Hmm.
And I wanted to ask how you think about the I that appears on the page. So the lyric,
Yeah,
sometimes you use a lyric I to talk about distance. Like, what freedom does the poetic I, I'm talking about the letter I, um, offer you for approaching these really difficult things?
totally, totally. Yeah, when I first started writing poems, I thought that the I was me, or at least like the closest approximation to me that I could make. And that if I included a detail that wasn't strictly true, meaning like a verifiable fact or a really clear memory that I have at least, and we all know that memory is basically invention, right? Like if somebody comes in and kicks Rosie in the shin right now and then runs out, and I asked you what color shirt were they wearing, we'd all have a different answer probably, you know? Some people would be convinced it was a red shirt, some people would be convinced it was a green shirt, and we'd all have the exact same experience, right? So memory is completely, in my view, subjective. But back then I thought, well, my responsibility to the reader is to tell the truth in like a journalistic sense, you know? And I found that really, really limiting as an artist. And for some reason I was sort of holding myself to a kind of impossible standard for the genre, in my opinion. So I've come to now a looser view of what the I is. The I is still basically me, maybe even more so than most poets. But I'm not shy about transporting people across time. I'm not shy about putting things into people's mouths that they didn't necessarily say or didn't say in that exact way or whatever. I'm learning to have my hands looser on the wheel. One of my teachers at Stanford, where Rosie and I both had a fellowship, but at different times, Louise Glick, who's since passed away, uh, said to me, to be alive is to be at sea and to be grasping around for stability and not finding it. And so what I'm trying to do now in my poems around the I, but also kind of in every way, is to let the poem steer. So if the poem is kind of steering in a direction of me saying something that I didn't actually say or seeing something I didn't actually see, I try to just follow that impulse, right? Because for me, what's more important in the poem is not, I mean, maybe some people would have the impulse to fact check everything in the poems, but I think broadly speaking, people want to read stuff that feels true. And I want to make stuff that feels true. And sometimes to do that, you have to lie a little bit.
Yeah, that term, the emotional truth, right?
Yeah, 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 exactly. Exactly. I don't know. All I know is that my poems got a lot better and I was a lot happier when I gave myself permission to make stuff up or
Mhm.
like, make stuff up a little bit.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, similar in that vein, I think is a question from one of our terrific creative writing students, Bunny, who is asking, do you ever have moments when you cut things because they get too personal? Like, how do you kind of navigate that feeling? And someone commented in the chat, like, there's such a the vulnerability, right, really comes through in your work. So kind of maybe you could speak to navigating that personal stuff.
Yeah. Um, Sometimes, I get this question a lot, and I think for some people it stems from a place of care and concern. They're like, this must be intense for you, to write with that level of vulnerability. Um, and it is, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't intense, but I also feel like, what would I be doing? If I wasn't doing that, if I wasn't risking something in every poem, if I wasn't relentlessly digging to the core of the thing, the core of the feeling, the core of the situation, trying to get to the full complexity of it, and that involves a lot of well, it involves feeling kind of always exposed. And there are poets that don't do that, There are poets that make a game of it. There are poets that are really into aesthetics and they say like, oh, well, I'm trying to make something beautiful on the page, or I'm trying to make something complex and impressive on the page. That's never been me. I mean, if that happens in the poem, that's great. But my view is that I'm for myself trying to get to the bottom of something that I suspect is more complicated than I think at first. And so I'm making poems out of the raw materials of my life, and therefore I don't get to choose those materials, and so I don't get to choose if I'm going to be vulnerable or not. It's just kind of automatic for me, and eventually the poems feel like they have their own life, separate from me. You know what I mean? And it gets easier to read them because I think like, well, I've externalized this thing into this object of some beauty and strangeness. And that feels really liberating and good for me as a person who's been through a lot of darkness, Yeah.
Yeah, I want to take a question from a student to kind of build on what you were saying about this period of time of not writing, right? Like that
Yeah.
um, really, like what it's a terrible feeling as a writer, um, and also to that to how you came. What advice you have for like coming back to poems with joy via, like or not via, but despite that sort of like frustration, and how to navigate this sort of like now that poetry is kind of your job in part, right? Like, how do you keep it feeling not like a job?
Yeah. I don't think that writing poems is my job. I'd start there. I mean, I think teaching is my job, and I take that job seriously. But writing poems is not my job. Writing poems is something that I do to try to make sense of my life. The poems are a part of how I'm living. I think I said in an interview recently. Um, I reject that. I reject that out of hand, but not in a mean way. I guess I just mean like if I made poems, writing poems my job, then I would have to feel guilt about not doing my job, or I would have to feel I would have to entertain ideas of productivity. I'm just trying to get away from that entirely. If I feel moved to make a poem, then I try to make a poem. I think the second that you make it a job, you open yourself up to feeling bad about your work, your productivity or lack thereof, or the depth and complexity of your work not being enough or something, right? Like I want to stay as far from that as possible. I think the relationship you have with the blank page and with your art is sacred. And I think you have to treat it accordingly. Try not to expose it to the kinds of forces that would jeopardize that relationship.
Market forces.
Market forces, exactly. Listen, it used to be you can you can make the argument that poetry is bigger than it's ever been, and or maybe not ever been, but ever been in recent history, and that's a good thing. More people are writing poems. There's a bigger market for poems. People are getting paid more to make their poems. But I also think it's sinister. I think one of the beautiful things about poetry used to be it's complete. inutility, is that a word? I'm thinking of the Spanish word inutil, right?
I'm
But
thinking of the French
um,
word. Yeah.
yeah,
Inutility.
really, yeah. Yeah, it's lack of utility. It's useless, but it's essential. And so, all this money flowing into poetry, I think, is not very good for the art because then people, of course, and I'm probably guilty of this too, in some ways, write toward what they think is going to be profitable. And that's the death of the art right there. As soon as you start thinking about market forces, you start thinking about what kind of tweet would go viral or what an editor might want or how would you get more followers on social media or something. You're getting farther and farther away from what you uniquely have to offer to the world. Um, and so it's impossible to avoid those forces entirely, but I'm in my old age at 35, I'm trying really, really hard to get away from that stuff. I was very, very ambitious as a young poet, and I'm trying to be ambitious in a different way now. I'm trying to be ambitious for myself and for the work, trying to push it into strangeness and depth every time instead of looking for awards and recognition and money, God forbid. Yeah.
I know. I was just having a thought today when I was like, some of these huge prizes should be parceled out a little bit. Um,
I know. Well, so many of them seem to go to the same people too. And you think, well, does that person need even more money? I don't know.
a
But it's not
valid.
equitable. And if you look for it to be equitable, if you look for it to make any kind of sense, you'll be so disappointed, you know? I mean, and another point I'll make is that don't let me get on my soapbox, Rosie. This is something I think about a lot. I was just in a coffee shop in St. Louis because I was giving a reading at the St. Louis Poetry Center, and it was a really cool like library type coffee shop where they had all these back issues of Poetry Magazine from like 2006 to 2008 or something like that. And you look through them and you think, I don't know any of these people. At the time, it was a huge deal that they were in Poetry Magazine. But then 20 years later, it's like, yeah, I don't know. Louise is in there, a couple other, major poets are in there, but no one can tell what's going to last. You know what I mean? And the now only seems important because it's now and we're living through it, right? Trying to shape my thinking in that kind of way uh, has, and I hope will continue to free me from the tyranny of the now and try to get me thinking longer term. How can I make work that's going to mean something in 20, 30 years? Of course, I have no idea if I'll even be read in 20, 30 years. Probably not. Um, but the idea, I think, is to make work that has a chance of lasting.
Hmm. I think that that's a very second book feeling, that realization of
Yeah,
that poetry, the life of poetry is a marathon. It's not, the first book feels like such a sprint, and then you realize
totally.
how long it is really.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question that kind of, if you'll recall, like several years ago, you were kind enough to zoom into one of my classes, and we were talking about Marie Howe,
Yeah.
and just how terrific, God bless her. She's an amazing, poet, but the lines are just like she'll just break wherever. Uh,
No, she's a maniac. No, no, I have never been able to figure out how Maria thinks she's breaking lines. I love her poems, but
yeah.
like, yeah, that's one aspect I don't get.
So I wanted to ask, because someone is asking kind of about the tendency in the book toward couplets, and I kind of wanted to build that a little bit. That question is like, um, what are your formal impulses, and what were they for the book?
Yeah.
Because you have some just incredible line breaks, I will say.
Thank you so much. Nobody talks about that, you know?
Except for me, because I'm obsessed. But
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. Thank you. Thank you. It's all I think about. I think about metaphor and I think about line breaks. That's basically it. That's the cornerstone of my writing philosophy. So for me, line breaks are a chance to disorient the reader. They're a chance to have a kind of doubling or tripling of meaning in the same way that metaphor does, right? Metaphor is asking you to look at one thing and then you understand, ooh, there's a secondary subject. There's a secret secondary thing. It's kind of like the two things are laid on top of each other. You get the one and you also get the other. And a line break can create that kind of blurriness, that kind of doubling. And I think that's something poetry does uniquely well. Um, yeah, a lot of couplets in the book. I can give you a heady answer, and then I'll give you the real answer. How about that? The heady answer is that a couplet is two lines, and so much of the book is about the relationship between the speaker and the father, the relationship between the speaker and the beloved, the relationship between the speaker and one brother or another, right? So there is a lot of like pairing happening in the book. Um, I don't know. That's one way to think about it. But really, I just like them. I just like them. I like poems and couplets because they have a lot of white space, and you can use that white space to your advantage. I think when the poems start to, I mean, I can never write in a couplet again, right? I did my couplet book, and now I've got to find some other way to write poems. But uh, I really like how it allows you to pace the reader's experience of the poem. It's like formal considerations in a poem, I think, are kind of like a composer writing a score, right? There's like forte and pianissimo, and there's crescendo and decrescendo and so on, right? It's like musical annotation. And how we control the reader's experience of the poem is basically through lineation. So for these poems, for whatever reason, I felt like a relatively short line, a lot of enjambment, and and couplets felt like the right kind of pacing, the right kind of musical annotation for the book. Is mostly an intuitive sense. But I will say, and hot tip for those of you that write poems, I take every poem and whatever I wrote it in, couplets or tercets or whatever, I put it back into a paragraph. No line breaks at all. And then in the Word document, I copy and paste it like 10, 15 times. And then I go through and try out different lineation strategies on each one. So I'll say like, okay, here's one where I'm going to do 3 syllable lines and like really, really heavy enjambment and no punctuation. It'll just go zoom down the page. The next one, I'll try like 15, 20 syllable lines, a lot of end stopped energy, and see how that feels. So on and so forth. And you usually, none of those versions feels quite right, but you learn something about what effects you could create by doing that exercise.
Yeah, I think it's I can't imagine, it's hard for me to imagine to go to be a poet in a time where you're writing longhand, because we have it so easy to be like control P, like return, return, return. We can just like create all of these different versions and look at them, and it's so easy.
I know, you know. Yeah, I'd love to be a handwriting poet, or I'd love to be a typewriter poet.
Mhm.
On second thought, maybe I don't want to be a typewriter, but it's so mannered. It's so like, give me a break. But there's something, I'll say this, writing is a bummer, physically, right? What are you doing? It looks terrible. You're hunched over your keyboard, tapping away. What does a painter look like? Majestic. What does a dancer look like? Majestic. Even a photographer is getting out into the world and capturing these little moments of time and arresting them in the film. Poetry looks like nothing. Every once in a while, somebody tries to make a movie about it. Wasn't there one with Adam Driver where it was actually mostly about him being a bus driver because writing poetry doesn't look like anything? Anyway, I get bummed out about
Patterson,
how, what's that?
that's the movie. Patterson.
Yeah, Patterson. Yeah, I didn't even watch it because I thought it would be too depressing. But I'm bummed about how unembodied writing poetry is. And so I'm always looking for ways to make it more embodied. Unfortunately, for me, writing on my laptop in a coffee shop is just the way to go. It's just how my brain works.
Yeah, I feel you. It lacks total visual drama.
Yeah, I know. It's a drag.
Yeah. Well, I want to, so because I love these, hot tips for poets. Maybe that should be my like new podcast, just what everyone needs. But I wanted to maybe close with a question like that.
Yeah,
Um, including, and this is I'm gonna do that thing where I kind of like shoehorn a couple of things into the one thing, but
sure.
including like what writers you're reading lately that you're finding to be inspiring or are bringing you to the page,
Yeah.
and also just what things you've been trying with yourself lately in your own writing that have been working. I hope this is not like a stressful, like I hope I'm not
Well,
meeting you in a space where you're like nothing,
well,
nothing is,
yeah. The
I have
truth
been there.
is, the truth is, I'm not writing. I'm
Mhm.
not writing, and that's devastating. But also, I'm trying to be okay with it. I'm trying to give myself the time to rest. I've been on tour nonstop for 8 months. You know what I mean? That's a long time. It's the longest I've ever traveled for. It's the longest I've ever tried to sustain an energy. You know what I mean? So I think it's okay. I think there's this Twitter account. I think it's a Twitter account called the Nap Ministry. Do you know about this?
I do,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And they're trying to encourage napping as like as a radical act, as kind of radical self-care. And I'm telling myself that's what I'm doing. I'm resting. You know, I'm resting, I'm busy in other aspects of my life. And so the writing is just not coming, and that's okay. Um, so much of writing is about faith, right? If I turn to the blank page, something will happen. Or at least if I show up often enough, one of those times, something cool will happen. There's no reason that that would be true. And in fact, I live my life in fear of it not being true. Louise Glick, I think, said that what drives me back to the page is the fear that nothing will ever happen again. You know, after every poem, I think, well, that's it. That's the last poem. It doesn't seem possible to create magic once one magic trick has happened. You know, and what helped you in that one poem is not going to help you in the next poems. I mean, every poem is you try to repeat the thing, you try to capture the same lightning in a different bottle, and it doesn't cooperate. You know, you can't. You've got to. Every poem has its own terms and conditions, and you find them out as you go. So anyway, that's a long way of saying I'm not writing, but I'm trying not to feel that bad about it. That said, I've got some book recommendations.
Sweet. Spill.
Cool. Yeah, there's this book called Burying the Mountain by Shangyang Feng that I think is really, really good. It's his first book. It's really, really erudite and considered and sort of classic in its sensibility. It feels outside of time, which if you read a lot of contemporary poetry, some of it starts to sound very, very similar. And you think, oh, a lot of people are doing basically the same thing. Shangyang's doing something really different. He's kind of taking modernism into the 21st century in a way that I find really arresting. I mean, a lot of people think they're doing that, but I think he's actually doing it. It's really, really cool. Yeah, dense, lyrical, gorgeous poems. Oh, what else? I read this novel recently by Magda Szabo. It's a Hungarian novelist. So many of the novels that are translated and put out by the NYRB, the New York Review of Books, are stunning. And this one is no slouch. It's a Hungarian writer. She only wrote a handful of novels, or at least only a handful are translated into English. And it's a post-war novel, talking about life in a neighborhood in Hungary in that weird time after the conflict has ended and before the rebuilding has begun. So many poets too are writing out of that time. Szymborska and Miłosz and so on. A lot of those Eastern European poets capture something similar in some of their poems. So those are two reading racks. I don't know. Let me look around my office. What else do I have? I've been going more and more into the past. I think I'm a little tired of the present, you know? I'm tired of like looking to the present for inspiration. I just don't think the present is that important, you know?
And there's something that's in the way of looking into the future.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Only
Yeah.
one direction to go.
Well, and honestly, it's hard to see the present. It's hard to see the present. You can see the past with a little more clarity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, I think that New York Review of Books suggestion is great. I mean, like everything that comes is like weird
Yeah,
and wild and amazing.
totally. There's this book by Lucia Berlin that I really love too, called A Manual for Cleaning Women. Do you know this one? She was
Mm-mm.
kind of a rediscovered, kind of in the vein of like Dennis Johnson or something, but really weird and in some ways better. Um, More experimental, I think, even than Johnson is in most of his work. Lucia Berlin, A Manual for Cleaning Women.
Mm, nice.
I'm obsessed with dialogue, Rosie. Honestly, I think I'm a fiction writer, you know? I just am also a coward, so I make really small things.
Hey, I'm always propagating the idea that poetry is the less or the braver one.
Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well,
I get you on the small.
we have to believe it anyway, you know, to keep going.
Um, no, I think that this is I think that that's a wonderful note to end on actually, because I think uh there is so much like beautiful bravery in the book. And I'm so glad that you could come and come to our virtual space and read for us and talk to us, Edgar. And I know my students are have really gotten so much from interacting with your book and thinking about it and talking about the poems. So I want to thank you also on their behalf.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Thank you.
and to call it, to call it a night and let everyone go to their Game of Thrones finales,
Cool.
their dinners, their evenings.
Can I say just one last thing? I've been thinking about an early question that you asked. Is that all right, Rosie? I know probably
Yeah,
people
I
are
mean, I
like
don't know. People
ready
people
to
are
leave.
like jumping off like rats
You
off a
know,
stick.
leave, yeah, leave a
But
few ready to leave. You know what I mean? But I've got one more thing to say, and that is that sometimes this is about the question, how do you write with such vulnerability and so on, you know? And I think that an important thing that I didn't say was that sometimes you're just not ready to write about a thing. You need time, you know? You need time. And you need to give yourself that grace. I tend to think like, I'm not being brave enough, or but like there's a distance that allows the lens to focus, you know? You can't even, and honestly, there's a forgetting that needs to happen too. If you remember something too clearly, I find that it's really, really hard to make a poem that has real mystery and intensity in it, right? When it gets a little blurry, I honestly think one of my superpowers is my memory is awful. And so it's not that long of a time period until my memory is sort of blurry to the point where I feel okay manipulating things a little bit more. I think if I could remember exactly what color the guy's shirt was that kicked you in the shin, it would be really hard for me to make a poem out of it. So there's also a kind of looseness and dreaminess that needs to happen. And if the thing is too hot and you're too sure of how you feel about it, then the poem's going to be no good.
yeah. I remember this interview you did with Megan Fernandez where you talk about how you're both funny.
Yeah,
Um,
we're
and I think
hilarious, honestly. You
humor
know,
is
we
like
don't get enough credit for that.
a distancer, you know? Like the second that you can make a joke, you've stepped away enough.
Exactly.
And there's that aspect that you can find in your book as well.
Totally. Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think the book is kind of funny. And I'm proud of how funny it is. It's at least funny compared to the first book, which is dire. It's very dark and intense. But the second book, I think, has some real, yeah, some good energy, some zingers in it, and so on, some playfulness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for having me, Rosie. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Edgar. And thank you, everybody, for coming. This is our last event of the year, but in the fall, we will have more readings coming at you in person or virtual, depending on a lot of factors, as it turns out. But thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Edgar, so much for reading for us.
Totally. What a pleasure. Yeah, good luck to you all in your own poems too.
All right. I think, do I just leave the meeting? Sherry's in charge. She'll figure it
Yep,
out.
I can end it.
Cool. Thanks, Sherry. Appreciate you.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.